In the time I was growing up and going to school, it wasn't that uncommon for the maps in the classrooms or textbooks to be a little out of date. Every once in a while, there'd be a map that was from the 1980s that still had the Soviet Union or a divided Germany on it. But another feature on those leftover 80s maps would be this random unlabeled blank diamond on the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. I eventually learned that this was a neutral zone between the two countries, not a part of either country's territory. What was even stranger, though, was that while the neutral zone was a thing, all of the 1980s maps that had the neutral zone were wrong without realizing it. How does that work? Well, let's look into some 20th century Middle Eastern history. So right after World War I, the Europeans famously drew their partition lines across the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, the Levant and Mesopotamia became colonies. Britain also had several colonies along the coastal regions of Arabia, with Oman being a British protectorate as well. With the rest of Arabia, you had a collection of independent Arab states. One of the states in particular, the Sultanate of Nejd, would spend the 20s and 30s unifying most of the region, forming the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. By 1935, Saudi Arabia and Yemen were the only two fully independent nations left in the Arabian Peninsula. However, part of Saudi Arabia's formation as a modern state meant that they were surrounded by European imperial powers that wanted hard borders. Before, any borders in the Arabian desert were approximate lines in the sand. It really only mattered controlling the settlements and the oases. There were also several nomadic Bedouin groups who would herd their animals across long distances, and attempting to put hard borders over such areas were not only hard to manage, but didn't necessarily make sense. It would cause some problems. One of the earlier border treaties was made before Nejd fully became Saudi Arabia. In 1922, since the British controlled Iraq and Kuwait, the Treaty of Muhammarah was signed on May 5, 1922 to prevent any potential conflict. Then on December 2, 1922, the Protocol of Uqair was agreed upon. The new official British Nejd border went along this line. This basically reduced the claim size of Kuwait, but confirmed the growth of Mesopotamia from the original borders back in the Ottoman days. This new border made two neutral zones, one on the coastal end of Kuwait's border, and the other being that diamond-shaped neutral zone mentioned at the beginning of the video. These neutral zones were created for those Bedouin herders to be able to move across the area without causing any incidents. Any pastures or wells could be utilized by people from both areas, and no permanent buildings were allowed. Despite this being an attempt to establish a hard border, both sides were fine with the two neutral zones, because at the end of the day, the British got a border of some kind, and for the Saudis, it was still a line across the desert, so it really wasn't the most important thing in the world to worry about. However, as time went on, there was interest in removing the neutral zones. Oil was discovered as early as the 1930s in the Kuwaiti neutral zone, and with oil being important to both countries' economies, their interest in figuring out how to settle those resources grew. In 1961, the British left Kuwait, and in 1965, the two countries signed an agreement to partition the zone between them, so they could benefit from the oil resources there. In 1969, the partition became official, ending the neutral zone between them. The other neutral zone along the Iraqi border, however, had a different story. In 1975, Saudi Arabia and Iraq agreed to partition their neutral zone, and they finalized the agreement with another protocol agreement in 1981, which also adjusted the entire Saudi-Iraqi border to make a more simplified one. However, unlike the other neutral zone, these events were kept secret outside of their two respective countries. In the post-World War II world, any official border treaties would be registered through the United Nations once agreed upon. This helped create a record should any future conflicts arise. But the 1975 and 1981 agreements were never submitted to the UN, so while the international world knew this partition happened, they didn't know any of the specific details. What's strange is no one seems to know why these details were kept secret in the first place. It's one thing to say you can settle something yourself and you don't need anyone's help, but it's another thing to just not tell anyone you settled it. Maybe the authoritarian natures of the Saudi monarchy and the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein were distrustful of the UN, but I fail to see how simply registering the treaty would have been something to worry about international interference over. Then again, Saddam also took power in Iraq after the 1975 agreement anyway, so who can say? Now, many map companies took this information and used some common sense. It was probably a straight line from one corner of the diamond to the other, so they just assumed that. Perhaps they would show like a weird dashed border of some kind to indicate that sort of thing. Other maps, however, decided to play it safe and leave the neutral zone in. What if Saddam agreed to some wacky border and they drew the wrong thing? That would be embarrassing. Well, okay, probably not. Nevertheless, with the details of this border change being kept secret, how did we eventually find out? Well, Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990 and started the Gulf War. While it is true there was a desire to control Kuwait's oil fields, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had also incurred a lot of debt with both them and Saudi Arabia. So with the international buildup of forces in 1990 being stationed in Saudi Arabia, Saddam Hussein for some reason thought he could invade Saudi Arabia too, although that didn't last very long. Hussein declared that any previous agreements with the Saudis were now null and void, which would have included the partitioning of the neutral zone. But once the international coalition of armies defeated Iraq in 1991, Saudi Arabia, as a giant middle finger to Iraq, decided to register those agreements with the United Nations. Oh hey, look! We have the documents already signed by the Iraqi government, so no takebacks. Obviously, Iraq by that point was in no place to object. The secret border change from 1981 finally went public 10 years later. And finally, those batch of maps were made obsolete. This, of course, was not the only neutral zone during the Cold War. There are neutral zones along the Spanish-Moroccan border, and of course there is also the famous Bir Tawil region along the Egyptian-Sudanese border, claimed by neither country. I made a video on that too, by the way, if you want to learn more about that. But for now, I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.